Ребята, всем привет, добро пожаловать на мой канал, меня зовут Ксения, не забывайте с ним подписаться, чтобы не пропускать интересные видео с Салем, которые выходят на канале каждый день. И сегодня вас приветствую в втором видео моего третьего дня путешествия в город Салем, штат Массачусетс, там, где происходило знаменитое сжигание ведьм в принципе. И это будет на самом деле мой первый музей для посещения, естественно, музей про ведьм. Это один из самых популярных музеев, но местные на самом деле его не любят, говорят, что он очень раскручен, хотя на самом деле он ни о чем. И то, что это максимально, не соответствующее, так скажем, для посещения место. Так ли это на самом деле, судить вам? На самом деле там нельзя было снимать, поэтому весь материал я снимала подпольно, поэтому он будет немножечко, наверное, из странных, грубо говоря, мест, но надеюсь, вам понравится. Всем приятного просмотра. Это как выглядели девочки и мальчики, что носили примерно в 1692 году. Здесь реально отсвечивает свет, это лучшее, что я могу вам показать.
Sanding the floors, molding tallow candles to light the long winter nights. For young people, especially girls, there was not much amusement. A girl like little Anne Putnam, having done her household duties, would not be encouraged to run and play, to meet boys, to be frivolous. The Puritan God forbade it. Trapped as they were in this somber adult world, it is not surprising that girls of the time became restless and resentful. But the hand of authority was so heavy upon them, they dared not express themselves, except sometimes in attacks of what we call hysteria, wild, destructive emotional outbursts. Anne had more reason than most for being disturbed. Her mother was an embittered woman whose sister had died in childbirth. Mrs. Putnam herself had had 2 children who had died, and lately had started dreaming about her sister and her own dead babies. It seems that in her distraction, Mrs. Putnam considered turning away from her God and trying to contact the dead by forbidden means. And in this little Anne was to be her helpmate. For Anne was one of a circle of girls who had begun to meet quite regularly in the house of the Reverend Samuel Paris. The center of these meetings was old Tituba, a black woman whom Paris had brought back as his servant from Barbados. To amuse the girls, Tituba told them stories or showed them tricks and scraps of magic, some of which had probably come over with her ancestors in the slave ships from Africa. Anne's mother may have thought to use Tituba as her means of communing with the dead, but things shortly took a very different turn. Poor innocent Tituba. Little did she imagine that the tales she told to pass a winter's afternoon would soon be used against her. Nor could she have guessed that the terrible suspicions at first concentrated upon her would spread to involve so many, many others. The very fact that her circle met in the house of a minister made the girls all the more guilty about what they were doing. From playing at witchcraft, they would come to believe themselves bewitched and shortly be laying the blame for their condition upon others. An explosion was coming. One of the first to give way was Betty Paris, a frail, suggestible child, the daughter of the Reverend Paris himself. She began to fall into trance-like states, her eyes fixed, her body rigid. The disorder next spread to Abigail Williams, her cousin who lived in the same household. She began to babble or to run around on all fours, making barking or braying noises. When his daughter's condition became frighteningly acute, the Reverend Paris called in Dr. Griggs, a physician in the village. Dr. Griggs was at a loss. His simple medical knowledge told him the girl did not have fever or epilepsy or the usual forms of madness. What did she have? Whatever the malady was, dozens of other young girls would soon be catching it. Within a few days, Dr. Griggs would be making the same calls, asking the same futile questions in houses all over Salem village.
Betty, child, what afflicts thee?
Betty, speak, in God's name, who has done this to thee?
It began to seem to the villagers that they were seeing the devil's work. The girls were possessed. They twitched and spoke in tongues. It was not a case for medicine at all. Said the doctor, the evil hand is upon them. It was for men of the church to discover who was responsible. The girls now began to be questioned night and day, the Reverend Paris himself taking the lead in these inquisitions. The sternest efforts were made to wring from them some hint as to who had bewitched them. It was not an easy task. At first the girls would not answer. They simply screamed and writhed or did blasphemous things such as dashing a Bible against the wall. But gradually they began to give names. Betty Paris, driven frantic by her inquisitors and probably calling out to her own black nurse for help, thought, Tituba, oh Tituba. And that poor woman became among the first to be accused as a witch. Others, much less likely, named by the maddened girls almost it seemed at random, were also accused. Among them was a woman known all her life for piety and uprightness, but now grown old and ill and almost too deaf to hear the charges against her. Rebecca Nurse. The fact that Rebecca could scarcely walk at the time in no way affected the accusation of witchcraft. The hysterical girls, carried away, began giving what was called spectral evidence, visions they claimed to have had of the accused. According to Ann Putnam and Abigail Williams, Rebecca's shape, her astral self or soul, had been seen flying about, while in body she lay at home in bed. At first, no one in the town could believe it. But then her few enemies, among them Ann Putnam's mother, declared against her. On March 23rd, 1692, Rebecca Nurse was placed under arrest. Rebecca Nurse was finally brought to trial in Salem on June 29th, Chief Justice William Stoughton presiding. Even then, the townsfolk on the jury were not convinced. Mrs. Putnam and the girls who had testified against Rebecca were among the onlookers. A hush falls over the courtroom as Thomas Fisk, foreman of the jury, rises to deliver the verdict.
May it please the court, we find the defendant, Rebecca Nurse, not guilty.
Rebecca was cross-examined again about a remark she had made earlier in the trial. It involved a misunderstanding which, because of her deafness, she had been unable to clarify to the satisfaction of the court. Now, old and exhausted, she was questioned about it once more, but she was too worn out to defend herself, simply staring into space and making no reply. The jurors recessed once more. Now Thomas Fisk comes forward to deliver the final verdict.
We, the jurors, find Rebecca Nurse guilty.
So the law put itself at the disposal of this gathering madness. Before it was done, 19 would hang. Another, Giles Corey, would die a still more horrible death, and hundreds all over New England would be sent to jail, some for up to 7 years, languishing forgotten, long after the obsession with witchcraft had died away. Amid all this confusion, the farcical trials in which judge and jury gave in to the screaming of hysterical girls, amid fear and slander and random accusations, a few men stood out as heroes, steadfastly clinging to their reason and their principles, even in the shadow of the gallows. One of these was John Proctor. From the first, he refused to be swept up in the general panic. Unlike others, he saw the hounding of witches to be nonsense and said so. When his own servant girl was afflicted, he turned her over his knee and spanked her, temporarily curing her. His outspokenness attracted the attention of the girls. His pregnant wife Elizabeth was soon accused and haled into court as a witch. When he took the stand to defend her, he was denounced by one of the witnesses, Abigail Williams. By spectral evidence, she suddenly discovered that he too was a witch. And the other girls at once joined in. 52 people signed a petition on his behalf, but it was no use. In August 1692, this brave man and his wife were condemned and sent to jail. John's prophecy was coming true. The girls, he had said, will make devils of us all.
Witch! Witch! Witch!
By the summer of 1692, others all over New England, some 250 in all, had been thrown into prison. The accused sometimes sharing cells with their accusers, witnesses whom the girls had later turned upon and implicated. Rebecca Nurse, even after her ordeal in court, was not let alone. The girls claimed that her soul was escaping and tormenting them still, so the old woman was loaded down with chains, as if these would somehow trap her wandering spirit. She was charged for her chains, just as she and the other prisoners were charged for the food they ate. Even those who escaped hanging were in some cases bankrupted by their terms in prison. Here is Sarah Daston of Charlestown. Her neighbors denounced her as a witch. She was tried and found not guilty, but she was too poor to pay her court costs and so held. Her relatives were years in collecting the money to free her, and before they did so, she died, innocent and all but forgotten, in this cell. Here are John Proctor and his pregnant wife Elizabeth. John is writing a last letter to the friends who had tried to save him. In defending his wife and their unborn child, he has at least succeeded. Because of her pregnancy, the court will grant her a stay of execution, and she will be released after the witch madness has died down. John is less fortunate. He will hang within the fortnight, on August 19th, along with George Burroughs and 3 others as guiltless as himself. And here is Tituba, the old slave, whose charms and tricks and tales told to pass a winter's afternoon were the start of it all. In fear of her insane masters, she has confessed and will eventually go free, never understanding what wrong she has done. Indeed, she did none, nor did any of the others. They were simply struck down by the dementia of their times, the way in ages to come men were to be struck down for holding the wrong political opinions, or for being of the wrong race. It is perhaps no accident that the Salem witch persecution began with a woman who was black, and that the devil himself at these trials was often referred to as the Black Man. Of all the 20 executed, the most piteous and stubbornly brave was Giles Corey. He was not blameless. He had believed in witches and even testified against his own wife. He was then accused himself. Under the law of those days, as he knew, to be a confessed witch meant to forfeit one's lands and one's fortune. Giles Corey determined to protect his heirs by never uttering a word in court. He was therefore condemned to the medieval torture of pressing, in which heavier and heavier weights were piled upon a man's chest until he either confessed or was crushed to death when his rib cage collapsed. Corey, a man of enormous strength, never gave in to his tormentors.
Giles Corey, wilt thou not speak and say yea or nay in thy behalf? What sayest thou? Speak!
More weight! More weight!
So be it then. More weight.
Others were more fortunate. They merely went to Gallows Hill. Among these was the Reverend George Burroughs, who was hanged on the same day as John Proctor. Burroughs, a former minister in Salem village, had been arrested and brought back from Maine. His execution was presided over by Cotton Mather, who had come from Boston for the occasion. It was thought in those days that a witch could not recite the Lord's Prayer without a mistake. On the gallows, Burroughs gave this final proof of his innocence.
And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Things had gone too far. Cotton Mather speaks.
The devil but speaks through the mouth of his servant. This man is guilty and shall hang. There shall be no reversals of justice in this place. Hangman, you may proceed.
So died George Burroughs, minister of the Lord, and 18 others in 1692, accused of witchcraft by enemies, superstitious neighbors, young girls in the grip of a vengeful hysteria. Once the witch mania had passed, it never came again to New England, and at its worst was never as bad as in Europe, where it is said millions were hanged or burned on suspicion of having made a compact with the devil. One might have asked then, and could still ask today, who is the devil? On whose side was he fighting? On whose side does he fight even now? Before the trials were over, one of the afflicted girls admitted that what she had done was done for sport. Later, other girls confessed, among them Anne Putnam, whose evil genius was perhaps as much her mother's as her own. Years afterward, in 1706, on the anniversary of a fast which the state of Massachusetts had declared in repentance for the Salem witch trials, Anne tried to make atonement for the terrible evil she had done. As she stood in her pew, Parson Joseph Green read her statement to the congregation, among whom sat the children of Rebecca Nurse.
I, Anne Putnam, desire to be humbled before God. It was a great delusion of Satan. I did it not out of any anger, malice, or ill will. And particularly as I was a chief instrument of accusing good wife Nurse and her two sisters, I desire to lie in the dust and be humbled for it. I desire to lie in the dust and earnestly beg forgiveness of all those unto whom I have given just cause of sorrow.
So it all ended. We may take pride in the fact that in a world such as that of the 17th century, haunted by superstition, by dreams of magic and satanic evil, We gave way but once, and then only briefly, to our fears.
And the rumor was that they would use those supernatural powers to start storms, plagues, and harm people, especially small children. Now, from the 15th to 18th centuries in Europe, that was a time known as the Age of Anxiety. And there was a lot of troubling things happening all at the same time. There was a lot of war, a lot of religious turmoil, there was also a lot of famine and a lot of plague. And in uncertain times like those, it's very human to go and try to place the blame somewhere else. It's very human to try to find a scapegoat. And during the Age of Anxiety, accusing someone of witchcraft was a very convenient scapegoat for all kinds of misfortunes. Now, these two women behind me are about to start telling you their stories. They are fictional characters, however, their stories and experiences are based off of truth and reality that thousands of people did actually have to go through.
My name is Agnes. I grew up on a farm in Scotland.
Mine is Katerina. I lived in a village in the Holy Roman Empire.
I always did what was expected. I got married and had children.
I grew older and learned the trade of the midwife. I never thought suspicion could fall on me.
It started with an argument.
It's a tragedy.
The harvest was bad that year. The drought had everyone worried. One morning, my neighbor asked to borrow a horse. He was so insistent, and I couldn't help but lose my temper.
Her husband ran to find me in the night. It was their 7th child, only a few months old. I did what I could, but the illness came on fast, and my herbs provided little comfort. My heart broke for the poor mother. My child has died. She could barely look at me.
I began to overhear gossip at the well.
Soon more were refusing my help. My neighbors, people I've known my whole life, wouldn't look me in the eye.
When they arrested me, I was 42.
I was 68. I was tortured.
They insisted I name others. They left me in prison to die or confess.
I was found guilty and sentenced to be burned at the stake.
We were innocent.
But it didn't matter.
History remembers our confessions, but doesn't tell our stories.
Alrighty, everybody, come on, come over here. We'll talk a little bit about how perceptions changed. So, if I ask someone in this room today to describe a witch, odds are you describe something to my right. A woman dressed in all black with the pointed hat, green skin, riding on a broomstick. So how do we go from our historical example to more of a stereotype? Well, during the witch hunt trial period, there's a lot of crazy stories that were circulating about witches. People were saying these individuals were riding around on broomsticks, pipes, poles, pitchforks, sometimes even backwards on goats. And they were rumored to have animal companions that helped them out with their bad acts, like cats, dogs, snakes, and birds. And increasingly over time, witches were depicted as older, more haggard women. And as those legal witch hunts began to fade from history, it was those crazy stories that stuck in our minds and in our imaginations to form the stereotypes of what is a witch today. And actually, a more modern edition of the stereotype is the green skin. In the original children's book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the West was never actually described to have green skin in any way. But when MGM was making the movie version of The Wizard of Oz, they had this brand new technology at the time called Technicolor. And they wanted to use that Technicolor technology to make that movie as colorful as they possibly could. And in the process, they made the creative decision to make the Wicked Witch of the West green, forever altering our perceptions of witches. Now, I'll let her talk to you a little bit more about how perceptions have changed.
Listen carefully, my pretties. In rural lands filled with darkness and stories, the imagination runs wild. Frightening tales of a sinister creature deep in the forest, capable of brewing potions over a bubbling cauldron, causing thunderous hailstorms and spreading devastating disease, sparking terror. Thousands were executed for a crime they did not commit. As time went by, laws changed, and witch trials came to an end, but stories lingered on. Though once grounded in real fear, memories changed with each generation. Over time, I was said to ride a broomstick instead of a pole or a goat. I was given a pointed hat and a black cat. Children were raised hearing tales of the old evil woman in a candy-covered house. As time continued to march on, I slowly gained new stories. I was brought to Hollywood and transformed into a beautiful housewife and the heroine of Hogwarts, brave, kind, and intelligent. I could be more than my history. I could be both powerful and good. Time goes on, and perceptions evolve. My role is different now, my legacy altered. But I suspect my story is not yet done.
Above that tan line is going to be general Western history, and everything below that tan line is going to be general witchcraft history. But the first date that we want to take a look at is 1439. That's the year that the printing press is invented. And that's kind of a big deal for us because for the first time, information is allowed to be produced and spread in mass. And that includes fears about witches. And now in 1486, this book called the Malleus Magnificarum was published. Now, Malleus Magnificarum is Latin for the hammer of witches. And that book was essentially a how-to guide on how to find, try, and punish witches. And at the time, it was the second most popular book of its day, only behind the Bible. Now, the Malleus had a lot of troubling information inside of it, especially in regards to women. The Malleus argued that women were intellectually and spiritually weaker, making them more susceptible to the devil's influence. Now, over 45,000 people were killed as a result of witch hunt trials. The vast majority of those accused and killed were women, and the Malleus most likely had a role to play in developing those perceptions. Now, the worst legal witch hunts took place in areas that had little governmental control, such as the Holy Roman Empire. And the last legal witch hunt took place in the Swiss canton of Glarus in 1782. And to quickly dispel the myth about what happened here in Salem, no one here in Salem was actually burned at the stake. Witch burnings were common in Europe as well as in Scotland. However, in England and in the English colonies, witches were tried as normal criminals and they faced the normal criminal punishment of the day of hanging. Now, I'm going to have everyone swing down to this side of the room, and we're going to wrap up with our third tableau and witch hunt wall. So today, there's still a pretty large legacy of witchcraft, including a community here in Salem that practices neo-pagan religion, meaning they draw their inspiration from the earlier religions of pre-Christian Europe. To my right is the Wheel of the Year. Essentially, this is a celestial calendar where you can find major holidays like solstices, equinoxes, and cross quarters on it. Now, I'm going to let the Wiccans tell you a little bit more about themselves.
What is a witch? Today, this word has inspired many with the weight of its history. We are Wiccans.
We practice a neo-pagan religion,
often referred to as modern-day witchcraft.
This religion draws on older, earth-based practices.
We recognize a male and female god and goddess, believing in balance and equality.
The devil plays no part in our religion.
In the modern day, the word witch holds both old and new meanings. It is a legacy of injustice and ignorance from which we have much to learn. What does this word mean to you?
You can see at the top we have a formula. Fear plus a trigger equals a scapegoat. That's essentially the formula that we need for a witch hunt. Here in Salem, there's fear of the god and of the devil. Dr. Griggs came along, he made his misdiagnosis. He said the devil is loose here in Salem. As a result, 150 townspeople across Essex County were accused of witchcraft. Second example of a witch hunt we like to talk about here at the museum is from World War II. Prior to World War II, there's a fear of Imperial Japan for a variety of reasons. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcefully removed from their homes and placed into internment camps where they were forced to spend the duration of World War II. These individuals lost practically everything: their jobs, their money, their life savings, and their property. And there's never any evidence to suggest that any of those interned were actually allied with Imperial Japan in any way. Actually, despite being interned, many Japanese Americans volunteered to serve in the United States military during World War II, where they had very honored and very decorated military careers. And it wasn't until 1988 when the president at the time, Ronald Reagan, finally formally apologize for the mistreatment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Now, this witch on wall is why history matters. As the old saying goes, those who neglect history are doomed to repeat it. It's only about learning about our past mistakes and our past strategies that we can help prevent future tragedies and future examples of scapegoating from happening in the future. Now, before you guys go, we do have postcards for you over there in that corner. They are of our witch hunt wall. If you can think of an example of a witch hunt that follows our formula, we encourage you to write it down the back and send it back to us or give it to a staff member here today. We'll actually take it, we'll put it on the database on our website. That's all I have for you guys. If there's anything in this exhibit you want to take a closer look at, feel free to. But I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Все, видео подошло к концу, экскурсия подошла к концу. Всем большое спасибо за просмотр. По идее, там не было ничего такого, кроме самой информации по вот этой истерии с ведьмами. Для меня это было обучающее, наверное, больше видео. Из немногочисленных экспонатов, на самом деле, из крутых. Там была книга Гарри Поттера, по-моему, The Prisoner of Azkaban, если не ошибаюсь, могу ошибаться, подписанная самой Роулинг. Также после самого музея был магазин сувениров. На его посещение находится в первом видео третьего дня поездки, ссылочка на него в описании, там было много крутых товаров. Я еще раз благодарю вас всех за просмотр. Не забывайте подписаться на канал, чтобы не пропускать интересные видео, которые выходят здесь каждый день. Также по ссылочке в описании будет мой инстаграм, где ежедневные какие-то истории, шорты, посты, рилсы на русском и английском языках. Прочекайте, вам понравится. И я стараюсь чередовать эти видео из поездки, потому что она уже прошла, с какими-то обычными влогами, поэтому, скорее всего, следующее видео из этой поездки, следующее видео из музея будет через одно. В общем, если вы подпишетесь, для меня это очень будет приятно, вам это ничего не стоит, плюс вы сможете не пропустить и посмотреть все самые интересные материалы из городка ведьм в США. Еще раз всем большое спасибо за просмотр, увидимся с вами уже завтра, ребята, и всем пока-пока.